Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for This Is CDR this week. This week we have an episode on MRV for ocean-based CDR, which we're very excited about. All right, so just as a quick background, This Is CDR is an event series that explores the wide range of carbon dioxide or CDR solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals that we seek to advance at every level of government in the US, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. OpenAir is a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR and CDR solutions that we believe are essential to solving the climate crisis. We always want to note that, first and foremost, when we're thinking about the climate crisis, it's really important to look at decarbonization and to decarbonize our economy to the extent possible and very rapidly over the next several years. However, we also recognize that CDR is an extremely important solution for residual emissions and other emissions that may be difficult or inequitable to abate. If you're interested in joining OpenAir or joining and learning more about what we're doing, we're a growing global community and we collaborate on all sorts of shared open source missions, both in the areas of policy advocacy, as well as R&D and CDR market development. So please do join us if you're interested. There should be some links in the chat that explain how to do that and where to find out more information. And for those of you who might be newer to carbon dioxide removal and want to learn more about it, we always want to just give a quick definition. So CDR is any kind of anthropogenic activity that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably stores it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. And a great resource to learn more about that is the Carbon Dioxide Removal Primer. It's very comprehensive and it's a great place to start or a place to learn more if you're looking more into the carbon dioxide removal world. And I believe there will be a link to that in the chat as well. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Chris, who will introduce our speaker and our session today. Chris, whenever you're ready.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Mega. Appreciate it. Chris Neidl here, based in Austin, Texas. Really excited for today's speaker and conversation. We got a whole bunch of RSVPs. This is obviously a really fascinating subject and one that a lot of people are thinking about. So excited to have our guest today, Dr. Jessica Cross, discuss it with us. And before I introduce our speaker, just want to go over some basic housekeeping notes. A lot of return guests, I know, but plenty of time to take your questions. That's an important part of the program. So definitely use the Q&A panel on the bottom there if you can, rather than the chat, then it gets lost and hard for us to organize. But after the presentation and a few prepared questions that Mega will moderate, we'll go ahead and turn to the questions from you all. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. We're really pleased to welcome NOAA Research Oceanographer Dr. Jessica Cross, who's going to discuss the challenges associated with measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, of ocean-based CDR methods and how we can seek to address them in a climate-relevant timeframe. Dr. Cross is a research oceanographer with the NOAA office in Seattle, Washington lab. Her current research focuses on carbon biochemistry and ocean acidification in Arctic regions, and especially along the Alaskan coast. The main goal of this research is to better understand how acidification processes interact with natural biochemical cycles and eventually to detect geochemical and biological impacts of acidification in marine systems. Dr. Cross conducts her research across a variety of platforms, including ship-based measurements, moorings, and mobile autonomous platforms like gliders and drones. It's a lot funner than my laptop life. Through NOAA's innovative technology for Arctic exploration program. She also broadly participates in Arctic research community through the Northern American Carbon Program, the Ocean Carbon Biochemistry Program, the Pacific Arctic Group, and the Interagency Research Policy Committee collaboration teams. So real expert we have here today and excited to introduce her. So Dr. Cross, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be able to join this group this morning. I am sort of humbled by this invitation. As you heard in Chris's introduction of me, I've spent the vast majority of my career working on observations And you can see a couple of snapshots of that here. I actually just returned from a month in the field working in Southeast Alaska, collecting carbon measurements. And like Chris said, really what I use, my investigations of the carbon cycle for is to study ocean acidification. And I really spend about 6 months of my time doing that. Like, how do we make those measurements? Do we make them from ships? Should we be making them from gliders and drones like you see in the lower left? But recently, the other half of my job has been to sit in front of a laptop and think about ideas like MRV for CDR. And there's a real reason that I, in particular, have been interested in doing that. And really, it's because my work with Alaskan communities has taught me that the number one question that I'm going to get after I talk about climate risks or ocean acidification is, what do we do? This is a lived experience for so many people in the state of Alaska and in the small communities there. No one is arguing with me about whether or not climate change is real or ocean acidification is happening. What they want to know are, what are the strategies that we can employ to mitigate the risks that we're already experiencing or that we might experience in the future? Or if we can't do that, how do we adapt to those risks? And so I've spent a lot of time over the course of my career really trying to implement this climate resilience cycle, not just, the basic work that most climate scientists do of exploring hazards and really assessing what the risk to, different sectors or different communities might be, but also, what do we do about it at the end? What are the options that we have to mitigate risk or to adapt to those risks? How do we prioritize the potential solutions? And then how do we implement those going forward? So I really think of my research as one part of this wheel of climate resilience. And really, it's Alaskan communities that came to me originally talking about carbon removal and saying, isn't this going to work? Isn't this going to be one of our options? And initially, I was very skeptical. But the more I look into it, the more I realize this is absolutely something that's going to be a part of our future. It's going to be something that's implemented on the local level, on the regional level, as well as on the national and the global level. And it is definitely going to be a part of our climate solutions portfolio. And as researchers, we need to be investing our time and our understanding to investing our time in order to understand how this is going to impact, carbon cycles and the way that we do our work. So I know that this is a large group of wonks that are on the line today, and that many of you will have really good technical information about how much CDR we need, where we're going to put it and stuff like that. But I find when we're having these conversations about MRV, if we don't start from first principles, we get really lost in the details at the end. So I'm going to start simply talking, about a, review of material that I'm sure a lot of you already know. Then we'll get into a little bit more detail about several marine CDR or ocean CDR methods. How much are they sequestering? How fast? How long does that sequestration last? And really whether or not we can measure or verify those answers yet. What is that going to cost? Right? The MRV that we apply is really going to be based on the amount of resources that we have to devote to MRV. And then, how can we build an economy that can really support that cost? Overall, the primary concern when I think about MRV is how good is good enough? How can we make sure that people can participate in a market of carbon offsets or carbon assets? And also that we can trust that that market is actually doing what it set out to do. Is the quality of the offsets or the quality of the assets in that market high enough to actually articulate the value of those assets going forward? So again, just starting from the very beginning. According to the IPCC, we know that we're going to need something like 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year out of the atmosphere by 2050, and that's increasing to 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by about 2100. A lot of times we think very specifically about how are we going to get that out of the atmosphere, but it's also where we put it, and it's also the magnitude of each installation that we're actually capable of building. We know that we need approximately 6% annual annual growth in the market based on, getting started just in 2020. Right? But what does that actually look like? By 2050, that's on the order of 2.5 million orca DAC plants operating. It's 5 million by 2100. That's a lot of infrastructure to build. How are we going to build that infrastructure? How are we going to make sure that that infrastructure is regulated appropriately? Another way of thinking about that is to aggregate all of these things together rather than trying to create an MRV system that is for each individual plant. Important, of course, for that individual plant to be able to sell its wares, but also, thinking about this in aggregate. When will we be able to see carbon removal in the global carbon budget? Many of you on the line will be familiar with this plot on the left. All I'm showing is time on the x-axis, and then the CO2 flux on the y-axis. These different wedges are the different components of what we think of as researchers as the global carbon cycle. So we have inputs like fossil emissions and land use change, our sources of CO2 above the x-axis, and then we have the primary sinks for carbon dioxide below the x-axis. That's what builds up in the atmosphere, how much is consumed by the land, and then how much gets stored in the oceans. And when we think about the amount of CO2 that we're actually talking about removing, that's almost the size of the present day sinks of carbon that we measure right now. Certainly very close to the size of the ocean sink by 2050. By 2100, that's almost the size of what builds up in the atmosphere every year. These are huge numbers that we're talking about. And so the way that we measure MRV is going to be very different at both this large scale than the way we do MRV on this very small scale. And we're going to need to take both of those things into account. But also, we know that that's going to have to come from a variety of different sources. And so the MRV system that we're going to be planning is really going to be contain a portfolio of solutions. Some of them will take place on land, but also some of them will take place on the ocean. And again, this may be very familiar to folks. The ocean is a vast reservoir of carbon already just in our natural system. But that being said, it's also one of the most difficult to access. Maybe we want to store a lot of the carbon that we remove from the atmosphere in the deep ocean, but it's very difficult for us to get it there. How do we efficiently make that transfer? Another reason we like thinking of the deep ocean as a carbon reservoir is because that reservoir is already so big. So the corresponding perturbation that we would want to make is by percent a little bit smaller. So it may be a little bit safer or less, cause less of a disruption to store carbon there. There's a lot of nuance that I just skipped over. I know that's just the reservoir argument for where we put carbon in the system. So how do we get it there? So this is just a review of the global carbon budget that I prepared as the leader of the carbon dioxide removal task force at NOAA. I am working with almost 60 different PIs across our agency to articulate what the agency's contributions to carbon removal might be in the future. And as I am doing with you here, we start from first principles. What does the global carbon budget look like? How can we apply some of these methods to take advantage of these processes that already exist? So I'm highlighting some of those here for you in these red boxes. The first way that we think of trying to get carbon from the atmosphere into the ocean is to think about growing plants in the ocean. That's everything from kelp farming at our coasts to thinking about iron fertilization off the coast. There's a significant amount of carbon flux that comes from just the biological pump component of the global carbon cycle. But then we can also think about methods like enhanced weathering that really rely on the inorganic pumps or the inorganic component of the global carbon cycle. Regardless of which end of this pump that you're working with, you really need to be aware of the secondary reactions and the secondary processes that are happening once you've performed that sequestration. As you can see, those get complicated once you start dealing with the ocean subsurface. And that ocean subsurface is important, even though we think of gas exchange as a primarily surface process. Ideally, what you'd be doing is, again, using the surface ocean to sequester that carbon, but using the deep ocean then to store it for long periods of time, again, away from the atmosphere where it might get coughed back out due to a variety of different processes. So again, like I said, when we think of MRV, we kind of lump that into several categories. Do we do it inorganically, really by ocean alkalinity enhancement? Do we do it biologically by relying on photosynthesis, biotic cultivation, whether that's of phytoplankton or macroalgae, or do we rely on some of these more engineered methods where we might think of stripping the carbon out of seawater, creating some kind of liquid CO2 product that then needs to be stored somewhere else? The product that I've been working on with NOAA and that our team has been putting together has really tried to assess each of these methods by a variety of different metrics. And what I'm showing here on this slide is an example of what that looks like. So we have a diagram of the process, and then as well along the bottom in each of these different slides, you'll see things like the storage potential along these thermometer bars. Obviously, for coastal blue carbon, the storage potential is very low, even though the storage duration is very high. For a method like coastal blue carbon, I think of this like a bank. It's a really good place to store carbon that you already have, right? At the same time, the bank is not where you want to put the majority of your assets as an investor. You want to make sure that you're putting some subset of your money in a place that it can grow. And certainly coastal blue carbon or the bank is not the place where that happens. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of reasons to invest in conservation and restoration of coastal blue carbon habitats. It's just that carbon removal, according to our assessment and according to the literature, really just isn't one of them. There's a variety of other ways that we can store carbon from the atmosphere. And given that I only have about 20 minutes to talk to you, I'm not going to get into detail of these individual methods. Again, I encourage you to look at these thermometer bars along the bottom of each schematic. But very briefly, we can use macroalgal cultivation and ocean fertilization to rely on the biological pump, this biological component of the ocean carbon cycle, to help us suck up CO2 from the surface ocean, with the idea then that it gets absorbed by the surface ocean on the back end. It really depends, the efficiency of that process then really depends on a variety of factors, namely what you use it for when you are done and how quickly you're able to export that organic matter away from the surface, either of the ocean or of the land where it may be exchanging with the atmosphere. So when we think, for example, about macroalgal cultivation, if you farm that kelp and use it for another purpose, that is net neutral at best. It is not net negative. And when we talk about CDR, we're only talking about net negative processes, or at least that's the definition that I'm starting from. On the other side, when we're talking about some of these inorganic methods like alkalinity enhancement or direct ocean capture, theoretically, we can run these reactions, and because there's a lot less chaos associated with the inorganic carbon cycle compared to the biological carbon cycle, again, remember those secondary reactions that was on the carbon cycle diagram that I showed you. Accordingly, the amount that you can store and the duration of that storage is a lot higher. Of course, for a method like direct ocean capture, where again, you're creating that liquid CO2 product, that doesn't really address storage at all. You have to find some place to put that. And so we can think about subseabed geologic injection. We can think about artificial downwelling that really pumps all of that CO2 down into the bottom waters of the ocean, but those are sort of decoupled from the removal method. So accordingly, the duration of storage really depends on the method that you choose. It also depends on what you do with it at the end, once again. So if you, for whatever reason, remove that carbon and then you choose to use that carbon for another purpose, such as, enhancing fossil fuel extraction or, enhancing other industrial processes, is net neutral at best. It doesn't count as CDR. So one of the main questions that I've gotten and that the organizers really wanted me to emphasize and to talk about as a part of this webinar is what happens after you take carbon dioxide out of the seawater. Does the ocean actually absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere, or is this a myth? Really, I would love to give you a straight answer, but I can't. The answer is that it depends. Those of you who are familiar with making gas flux measurements in the ocean will know how deeply oversimplified the point that I'm making here is. But in general, sea air gas flux is facilitated by three factors. When you're talking about rate, it's how strong is the sea air disequilibrium, essentially how much carbon did you remove from the surface ocean, and how strong is the wind. How quickly are you able to encourage the surface of the ocean to interact with the atmosphere? And that'll give you a rate of gas flux. But if you want more than rate, you have to start thinking about integrating over time and space scales. How long did you wait? Over what area are you trying to determine the actual amount, whether that's volume or weight in petagrams of the carbon that was actually exchanged with the atmosphere? You have to be really careful about those integration methods. And in 20 minutes, once again, I do not have time to give an entire lecture on gas flux. When I was in chemical oceanography in graduate school, we devoted multiple 2-hour lectures to this idea. So very briefly, I'll just note terms and conditions apply. Things like the temperature of the water at the time that you actually did the sequestration activity, or the prompted the gas flux activity versus the temperature of that water year round, or what the annual average temperature of that water is, makes a difference to the answer that you get when you're trying to determine how much carbon the ocean actually sucked up. Surface barriers. Whether that's a surfactant that's created by, for example, just phytoplankton detritus at the surface of the ocean, or in my section of the ocean, a surface barrier like sea ice, that makes a difference to the efficiency of that actual gas transfer that can happen. You're effectively putting a cap on the ocean or applying some more resistance there. You can also have really broad debates about things like wind speed products, gas transfer velocity parameterizations. These are, again, really weedy ideas that make a huge difference in their application. Integration scales can also vary, and they vary not only for each place that you're trying to do this work, but also every time that you go there, you have to take a whole new look at how you're applying all of these different questions that I just asked. These are hotly debated. These are the #1 reviewer comments that I get when I submit a gas flux manuscript to the literature. These are the #1 arguments that people have when we're trying to determine what the actual baseline global carbon cycle looks like. These are not simple questions. Very small variations in the answers have a really big impact on the results. If you're interested in learning more about gas flux, I hyperlinked one of the benchmark publications that everybody that's in a chemical oceanography class would need to use at the bottom of the screen, as well as a chemical oceanography lecture about gas flux if you are really wonky and you want to learn more about it. So accordingly, because that's so hard to measure, there isn't a real set of certification or MRV standards for MCDR yet. This is from Stephanie Arcusa's really excellent synthesis where she tried to define what MRV or what certification procedures were in place for which kinds of CDR methods. What I'm highlighting in the red box in the lower left is the marine or ocean-based methods. And as you can see, there are not a lot of lines connecting that bottom CDR method row to the top CDR market or CDR certification section of the plot. So again, the reason that we don't have those MRV methods is because we're really not that great at making these measurements efficiently at either the large scale or the small scale. Those of you, again, who are on Twitter will probably be familiar with David Ho's Twitter feed. Here on the left, he highlights the fact that whether we use models or whether we use observations to try and understand, again, our baseline global carbon cycle, this is just the benchmark against which we will be trying to measure change, is really, really big. as he states, 925,000 orca DAC plants worth. It's really challenging for us to, again, measure these baselines, whether we're using models to do it or whether we're using observations to do it. On the small scale, we're really no better. What I'm showing here on the right is a time series that was collected during a kelp sequestration project in Puget Sound by my colleague, Simone Allen, and her team. What I really want you to notice about this time series plot is just the amount of noise that's inherent in it. No matter where you're really trying to measure in a kelp farm, the drawdown of CO2, what you're gonna get is this really noisy run. There's some logic that says, hey, we can pick our sites a little bit better at the small scale. And accordingly, when we pick those sites better, we're actually able to reduce some of that noise and really be able to see the sequestration that's happening at each individual site. But that takes a lot of planning, and it also takes the availability of a local scale or a regional scale model where you're going to be able to apply some of those metrics to, again, take out that noise. So this is really, really difficult. So then the next question that I get a lot is, okay, Jess, well, if it's impossible to make these measurements, why are we bothering with MRV? Why can't we just use the theoretical calculations that say, hey, this should be a 1-to-1 ratio, let's go for it. Let's just get the market off the ground, right? So my argument is that we should be a little bit more careful than that. And just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So really right now, it's a combination of observations and models that really enable us to do what we can with the global carbon budget as it exists. It's flawed. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect baseline, but we need both in order to be able to solve the global carbon budget as it is. On the other hand, new technology is being developed all the time that may make the facility of these measurements a lot better. We may be able to make these measurements a lot easier in the future. A couple of those examples I'm providing here on the right. Biogeochemical Argo is a set of floats that are freely deployed in the open ocean that are getting used for new purposes all the time. We would really love to be able to use them for gas flux, and certainly a pilot project in the Southern Ocean is working on doing that right now and is coming up with a lot of really unique answers just based on the new amount of data that we're able to collect. XPRIZE ran a competition a couple of years ago on developing new sensors for ocean acidification and ocean carbon chemistry. There are open XPRIZes right now, as you all know, that really emphasize not just the carbon removal aspects, but also the MRV aspects of that removal. The last example that I want to give is one that I was personally involved with, which is the development of SailDrone. And so this is a surface drone that is overloaded with a ton of available observations. And prior to working with SailDrone, we were really restricted to being able to put like 1 or 2 sensors on a surface drone of this type. And really now SailDrones are so big, 21 feet tall by about 24 feet tall by about 21 feet wide. I mean, these are huge. They can carry a lot of sensors that enable us to do interdisciplinary work, and they can also be steered. Not only can they be steered, they can be steered and go fast. So we're able to cover a lot of really directed territory. And this is revolutionizing the number of measurements that we're able to make, the resolution of measurements that we're able to make. So in the future, as we consider applying MRV, we're probably going to continue to apply a combination of observations and models. And we're going to have to aspire to improvements, not just in the technology or not just in the sensors that we use to measure the ocean carbon cycle, but also the models, really getting to the point where we can really invest in these high performance computing opportunities is going to make all the difference in the resolution of the climate models that we're using. As our resolution improves, theoretically, our uncertainty will diminish. Of course, we're going to need more observations in order to verify those highly resolved climate models. It all fits together. So we need to be working on improving the computing capacity and the resolution of our models, as well as trying to improve the way that we make these measurements going forward. So how do we get better? It's really difficult to make these measurements right now. Therefore, it's really difficult to apply any kind of rigorous MRV. How do we get better? There is a whole host of organizations and people that are trying to do that right now. Very recently, Carbon Plan released its CDR verification framework. That just happened yesterday. What a cool resource. I'm having so much fun digging through it. But there's also test MRV out there for individual CDR methods. WHOI is co-sponsoring the EXOIS, the Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions project that will hopefully help develop not only iron solutions for removing carbon from the atmosphere, but also its MRV. Additional Ventures is trying to do the same thing alongside Ocean Visions for alkalinity enhancement. Carbon Direct worked with CHARM to do that for BECCS and other land-based methods. Frontier Climate has been investing in a spray of different opportunities for MRV, but really one of the programs that I want to point out to you is ARPA-E. ARPA-E is a component of the Department of Energy that's really interested in investing in these MRV solutions, not just thinking about the technology that we need, but also in terms of how that affects permitting and structures and all of that other kind of stuff. So keep an eye out for ARPA-E. How much is that going to cost? Well, the graph that I'm showing along the bottom is really just a back of the envelope addition problem that I did from a couple of National Academies reports. What I'm showing here is the average annual investment in federal research funding in billions of US dollars for the renewable energy industry. Between 1978 and 2013, that's this blue bar at the top, as well as the proposed 20-year investment in carbon removal strategies, and then adding some more for ocean CDR methods. As you can see, this is the scale that we invest in already. Like the kind of work that we're proposing to try and make CDR better, not just to improve the efficiency of these methods and the rate that we can remove carbon from the atmosphere, but also in their MRV is relatively small compared to the investments that we've made in other sectors. So even though this is a daunting expense, it's not that daunting when you put it in context. So we can think about MRV, in scientific terms, which I hope I've given a really brief overview already during this presentation, but this is as much a political and an economic challenge as it is a scientific one. Thinking about the way that markets are built is equally as important as thinking about the robust nature of the measurements that we make. So on that note, there's just a couple of points that I want to make. One of them is that markets evolve over time. What we want to do with MRV is balance the quality of the supply against the quantity of the supply. We want people to be able to participate in carbon markets without overburdening them with costs of MRV, for example. That was a justice problem that the European market dealt with very early on. For example, you want to be able to give small communities that may want a carbon credit for refusing to log a forest on their land. How much carbon is that actually? That community probably can't measure that. So how do you enable them at the very beginning to participate in this market, to earn money, to reinvest in more robust MRV that improves the quality of their asset, that enables them to, again, continue to build the value of their asset and their ability to participate in this market? Another way that the European market has thought about really trying to again balance quality of supply against quantity of supply is applying gates and holding a supply of different forms of carbon assets in order to try and stabilize price. And so this was an article from the Financial Times that really pointed out the different moments that the European carbon market had tried to apply some of these standards in order to reduce oversupply and stabilize price in their carbon market. The point being that more data, better MRV helps build value in a market. But then again, present MRV may look different than mature MRV. The standards that we apply at the very beginning may look different than the standards that we apply at the end. And so early products, the things that we're creating right now, may be heavily discounted, not only by their verification certainty, but also by other risks that those particular assets may encounter in the future. If I could make another point, other than the fact that markets evolve over time, it's that efficiency verification is not the only risk to removal assets. Good MRV is important. Good MRV isn't the only solution to understanding risk in carbon markets. So what are some of those additional risks? Not just incomplete process understanding, but also understanding the long-term stability of sequestration. This is from a program that NOAA runs on the right called Carbon Tracker, which tries to relate the land sink for carbon dioxide, shown here in the green bars at the bottom, to drought conditions and wildfire across the top. So it's really important for us to try and understand what the overall risks to a carbon asset are going to be, not just the verification certainty. When we're talking about how to apply discount rates, how to value these assets, MRV is only one part of the overall solution. Eventually, what we want to be able to do at NOAA is build maps that facilitate spatial planning and a better understanding of those risks, like the one that you see on the left. We don't want to grow kelp in a crab fishery. It would make it really hard for the crab fishery to continue to exist. At the same time, we don't want to grow kelp in an area where kelp is not meant to grow. That probably is going to lead to failure for you and your metrics or your assets. So we want to try and help articulate the risks and the efficacy of CDR projects, again, by creating these coastal planning maps or these spatial planning assets and products. So I'm not going to read all of the different assets that I think NOAA can bring to the table, or that I think that government can provide when it comes to, helping to support not just MRV, but also the development of these carbon assets. Obviously NOAA has a really robust observing network. We make 1 million measurements a day in over half of the world's global carbon observations. We also run global, regional, and local models that help us understand what carbon looks like at all of those various scales. Environmental impacts are going to be a really big piece of understanding the valuation and risk of CDR implementation. And then as well, all of this arrowing towards this idea that we really want to be able to create these decision support products that look good in maps. We want to do that with you. We don't want to do that in a vacuum. And so the National Ocean Partnership Program, or NOAA, has recently partnered with the Department of Energy and Climate Works to really try and facilitate these public-private partnerships where government know-how, expertise, standards can really be combined with the capitalization and speed that comes from working with nonprofits in the private sector. That's something that I also have experience with. That was part of what made the sail drone development so successful in our field, was an effective public-private partnership. So with that, I will stop talking. I think I was at roughly a half an hour, but maybe a little bit longer than that. And Mega, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. No, that was amazing. And actually, before I get started with the questions, quite a few people asked in the chat if you would be able to share that presentation, especially just because there were so many great links and things in there. So absolutely, I'm happy to do that. Great. Yeah, then we'll share that out to the participants who RSVP'd. Okay, great. Well, we usually like to ask people about how they got into CDR. I think you answered that pretty comprehensively in your presentation already, so I might skip a couple of the ones we had prepared. But maybe could you just talk us through a little bit of where the science is, as well as where the policy side of things and the sort of supporting infrastructure is? For a few different types of ocean-based CDR, and I'm going to start with just ocean alkalinity enhancements. So, where are we on that, and how? Both on science and policy, yeah.
Again, when it comes to policy, I don't want to say that there is a policy solution that covers any of this. There aren't voluntary standards, there aren't regulatory standards or compliance standards. This is all something that we're sort of making up as we go. There's a group at GeoMar that's very interested in MRV for ocean alkalinity enhancement, as well as additional ventures and Ocean Visions are also working on an MRV protocol to apply for ocean alkalinity enhancement. But in general, some more details about that method. The idea is that, we really want to be able to add more base to the ocean, but that results in secondary reactions. Uncontrolled secondary reactions can reduce the efficiency by 50%, essentially saying if we add 1 gigaton or 1 mole of alkalinity to the surface ocean, are we actually sequestering 1 mole of CO2? And no. If secondary reactions are uncontrolled, it can be approximately half, 1 to 0.5, or 2 to 1. Electrochemically, the idea is that we can control the pH of the effluent that is created, or to control the pH of the ocean once you've actually injected this alkalinity, and you can get a much better efficiency by controlling those secondary reactions rather than just letting all of this happen in situ. So a project that I was a part of that was led by Brendan Carter at the University of Washington and Hongxi Wang at the University of Rhode Island found an efficiency of about 1 to 0.97, which is really, really good. Again, when you think about crop dusting or just spraying the surface of the ocean with powdered material, in order to facilitate that reaction, you really have to powder the alkalinity, which reduces the efficiency that can work at. Again, your rate of gas transfer, whether you're doing this from an enhanced weathering perspective or an electrochemical perspective, depends on environmental conditions. A model, again, that we ran with Hongxi and Brendan indicates an e-folding timescale of about 5 weeks if you're just injecting tons and tons of alkalinity into the surface of the ocean. But that being said, that e-folding timescale then translates into about 6 months for 97% completion. So these methods are slow. It takes time to react to the surface of the ocean with the atmosphere. Did that sort of answer your question about state of the science, Mega?
Maybe just on the MRV side as well, like what are the biggest challenges on the scientific
side? How do we measure that? Okay, let me come down here. Okay, so thinking about MRV, again, this is Brendan Carter and Hongxi's output that I was able to contribute to. And so what I'm showing here on the right-hand side is just, a point source of electrochemical alkalinity addition to the Alaskan coast, to the Bering Sea. And really what I want you to notice is that the amount of gas flux that's actually created in this big plume can be really, really low, 0.05 millimoles carbon per meter squared per day across the magnitude of this plume. But at the same time, it's the spread of that plume that really, again, contributes to the efficiency of this method overall. So it's really, really hard to measure things at the low end of this scale, even though you can measure, the exact amount of alkalinity you're injecting into the ocean. And so we're going to need to, both measure the amount of alkalinity that we're injecting, as well as maybe some point source gas flux really around the site of this addition where it can actually be measured. And then we're going to have to use regional biogeochemical models like the output that I'm showing here in the background in order to articulate, the spread of that plume that you've created, and then what the total gas flux and the rate of that gas flux is over, a given space and time. So again, this really requires us to use both observations and models in a really coherent way in order to assess sort of what the opportunity for removal is.
Okay, got it. And then again, thinking about the MRV side of things, how does that compare with, either electrochemical approaches or permaculture? I'm sure the MRV considerations are quite different.
Sure. I am a unique voice in that I consider, enhanced weathering and electrochemical alkalinity addition to sort of be part of the same conversation. So I've kind of combined those as we've been talking. When you think about MRV for macroalgal cultivation or biotic methods, anything that relies on photosynthesis, that measuring the actual amount of carbon removed can be a lot more difficult. Secondary and downstream reactions that affect net disequilibrium are really poorly understood. So while you can measure, like for example, if you're farming kelp, you can measure the weight of the kelp that you've taken out of the ocean, doesn't really help you articulate the total amount of carbon that may be absorbed by the surface of the ocean. Did you offset another kind of production by growing that kelp? How much? So you have to really understand what the trade-offs are between macro and microalgae, right? Kelp also can provide a substrate for secondary precipitation. Barnacles, in other words, really precipitating carbonate for barnacles starts to cause CO2 to build up in the surface of the ocean. You also have to understand things like what got respired and what happened to that carbon dioxide, right? Did any piece of that kelp break off? Did it float out into the, surface of the ocean where it got eaten by bacteria and that CO2 got fluxed right back out? Or did it sink? If it sank, how long did it stay sunk for? Or did it just get, blown up onto the beach by the next storm that rolled through? These are all really difficult questions to ask. One of my favorite resources for thinking about these complex ideas is Leonard Bach's paper, where he used an existing sort of analog for macroalgal forestation to consider some of these issues. So we have to be able to measure when it comes to these biotic methods, not just the amount of sequestration that your photosynthesis produced, but also whether or not it offset other forms of photosynthesis. Also, you have to understand the vertical export, what happened to that organic material that you created after it was photosynthesized. These are all really difficult questions for us to ask and answer in the carbon community.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm just going to ask one last question because we have quite a few from the audience as well, and maybe kind of building on that idea. So, you talked a little bit about the role of, NOAA, governments, and all these different entities. We at OpenAir are obviously super interested in open source approaches to things. And so just wanted to ask, do you think there's kind of a role in here for an open source approach to solving some of these MRV related problems that are quite cross-disciplinary and, are a different thing that we've tried to solve before? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so my answer to that is that we work best when we work together. If I just went to Alaska and I tried to measure carbon concentrations, I could probably have a career doing that, regardless of whether or not it's fair. But I would like to know that the work that I'm doing is valuable, which means that I have to be talking to economists, I have to be talking to social scientists, I have to be talking to fishermen, I have to be talking to legislatures. And that enables me then to produce, or our team across Alaska to be able to produce maps like the one that you're seeing here that show the risk the relative risk to several communities for ocean acidification. Like I said earlier, also public-private partnerships enable to do this kind of stuff with speed. If you're just relying on us and the government to do this, we are going to be slow. How often do you hear that criticism in the news that government moves slowly or more slowly than we would like? Well, that's true here too, as it is in many other areas. So we really want to be doing our best to facilitate, community involvement. We want to do that when it comes to SOPs or standard operating procedures. We really want to do that when we're developing new sensors. We want to do that for QC and data management and the transparency with which that gets to be shared. I'm just showing here like a spray of different assets that our community has put together that, again, are sort of open source opportunities. But then I also wanted to highlight another opportunity that's coming up next week. We're hosting an MRV workshop, a community workshop on what these kinds of things should look like, again, in sort of this open source community setting. In-person registration for that workshop is full, but if you'd like to attend virtually, we are going to stream all of our plenaries, and we're exploring some virtual breakout solutions so that you can sort of share your perspective with us. Please get in touch with Heather Benway at the OCB Project Office. If you just Google the name of this workshop, it should be the first hit, and you should be able to find that link on the first page of the website.
Great. Well, I think based on the chat and the questions, there's a lot of people who are going to be interested in that. So Chris, I'll give it over to you to address some of those questions.
Great. Yeah. Excellent. Just amazing presentation. I feel that weird feeling you have, or you both feel impressed and invigorated and kind of dumb, because this is really complicated stuff. We have a lot of questions that came in, but many of them are sort of pertinent to just general sort of science questions about different forms of ocean CDR, which I'm sure you can speak to, but I want to start with questions that are directly related to MRV.
Sure.
One really technical and good one from Nate, I'll just read it at length here. If we potentially need to create different regional ocean models for MRV to estimate regional alkalinity fluxes as they interact with local physical and geochemical processes, how do you think this could be best executed? For example, as you know, it is labor intensive and it may be expensive for individual companies to do it. Should different groups or companies make different ROMS, I guess it's regional ocean modeling systems, I'm guessing, for similar ocean regions? Or do you think that we need a coordinated effort to generate these models so that companies may use a given set of ROM models depending on where they are? It's a good question.
Ooh, first, I will say that duplication is good. We want multiple opportunities, multiple simulations, I guess, to work from when we're trying to understand a system. It's the variability in those simulations that helps us identify key nuances. On top of that, my colleagues would find me remiss if I did not say that all models are bad, but some models are useful. So, having a variety of models to work from helps us, again, sort of test the boundaries and the veracity of different ways that these models are bad and identify the different ways that these individual models can be useful. That being said, do I think that we need 400 ROMS models for a given region? No. We don't have that anywhere. The closest analog that I can think of is kind of the Northeast Atlantic US, where there's, a variety of kind of overlapping ROMS models that serve, the different subregions of the Atlantic coast. Some in Canada, some in the Northeast, some sort of in the mid-Atlantic region, and then the Southeast Atlantic region. And those are great. Overlapping boundary conditions help us understand better things. But again, we're talking 5 here, not 400. So I would argue that, yes, we should, as a community, develop those ROMS models together so that they can be available for use, although maybe more than one is essential.
Excellent. Great. Here's another one. This is an excellent question that just came in, again, MRV related. This is from Anna. Anna's a marine robotics engineer, and she's really interested in applications of robotics to ocean MRV, which I know is a really important area of development. Where do you see the most important points of technology development that can both assist the science that needs to understand process a lot better, and that can also facilitate monitoring and verification? It's a very good question.
Wow. Okay. For one, high performance computing. We need better climate models. We need better resolution global models. We need better resolution regional models. We need better availability of local and small scale models, like I just said in response to the last question. So number one technology need, please help me run better models. The second need that comes after that is we really want to be able to understand a variety of components of the marine carbon system. So, there's several companies that are working on developing a total alkalinity sensor. Alkalinity is my favorite carbon parameter, so I'm kind of partial to getting a sensor that's actually able to help us measure alkalinity. I can kind of geek out over the nuances that are associated with that. Measuring organic alkalinity is something that even from discrete measurements, we don't even know how to do yet. So coming up with a process for measuring organic alkalinity would be really valuable. And then also, again, thinking about these biotic methods, one thing that we would like to be a lot better at estimating and measuring is export flux. What happens to a thing that grows at the surface ocean once it leaves the surface ocean? How fast does it sink? When does it get eaten by bacteria? How can you tell? There are several major programs that are really focusing on that right now that involve, 60 to 100 PIs. Like this is, an open question for the scientific community, not something that just one person is working on. But those are sort of my personal top 3. Others would argue that there are others to focus on too.
I love it. Really enticing. And I think that for us as an open source community, the prospect of working on an open source alkalinity center for oceans, I just think that is so ripe for acceleration of breakthroughs, just given how much sensor innovation is a part of the open source and maker movement. So keep your eyes here. Maybe that's something that we can start as a community. Here's a pretty general question, which I know that the asker probably understands that it's difficult to answer, but it's a good one anyway. And Irene asks, how far off do we think we are, from actually being able to credit ocean alkalinity enhancement activities with confidence? Again, if you just had to start to take a guess at how far away we are from sort of really locking that down from a carbon markets perspective.
Locking that down.
Or close enough.
I've been really impressed with the progress that we've made over the course of the last year. When I first started thinking about these things, these voluntary standards that I'm showing on this slide didn't exist. And so the fact that we're really trying to scale these up now, I think is surprising and exciting and heartening to me. When do I think we'll be able to actually trade some of these assets on a carbon market? I think it depends on the discount rate you're willing to accept. If you are willing as a buyer to deal with uncertainty, you can buy these offsets whenever you want. I'm sure that someone somewhere is willing to sell them to you. Whether or not they're accredited is another question, right? Whether or not you can insure the assets that you buy is another question that comes after that. I think that considerable progress will be made in the next 3 to 5 years. I think that we're going to see a lot of it in the European market before we see it in the US market. I know that's a squishy answer, but that's my expectation. Just keep an eye on the near term. It won't be 6 months from now, but it won't be that much longer. Great.
Well, I'll try another one. Hopefully that kind of answered. Phil had a question about what accuracy is sort of required, from an accounting perspective for this. So hopefully that helped answer some of his question. I'll just do one last one here because we're out of time. And again, I tried to stick to the questions that were really about MRV. This might be a hard one to answer in 2 minutes, but there is just the question of duration and permanence, and that really differs across the very different types of ocean CDR there are. But it seems to be that is just this whole other layer of complexity about how it is that you factor duration and permanence into MRV for various different forms of ocean tech. So I didn't know if you had any final thoughts on that particular nut to crack about how that's sort of incorporated into, and you can pick alkalinity or your favorite form as an example.
Yeah, sure. Rather than pick a specific method, I'm going to talk a little bit about ton-year accounting. That we want to, not just remove carbon from the atmosphere, but also remove it durably. And so semi-permanent solutions that sequester carbon, on the order of 30 to 40 years are great. Solutions that, remove carbon on the order of 100 years are better, and permanent solutions that we think can store carbon on the order of 1,000 years are best. That's, geologic injection, certain forms of alkalinity enhancement, depending upon who you ask. That being said, ton-year accounting really also, while it starts to incorporate durability as a metric for carbon assets, it also incentivizes, a lot of these short-term options, right? If you can earn 30 to 40 years of carbon credit, well, maybe that's good enough. Or maybe you can earn 2 years of carbon credit. It incentivizes renting rather than buying. And what we want people to do is buy permanent carbon assets, right? We want a housing market, not a rental market. Rental market's a lot more volatile, right? When we think about incorporating permanence, again, there are a variety of metrics. Frontier is using this list on the left. Durability is one of them, but also, verifiability is one of them. Additionality is one of them. There are a variety of different ways that you're going to value carbon assets. And all of those are going to go into assessing a discount rate for a particular asset. Or the price of a particular asset rather than just its discount rate. So I would say that durability is a factor. You can correct that by, going for ton-year accounting. There are challenges with applying ton-year accounting. It shouldn't be the only thing. Efficiency and durability shouldn't be the only two metrics that determine the price of a carbon asset.
Great. And we're at time, and I'm going to hand it right back over to Megan. Thank you so much, Jessica. This was fantastic.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I think if you've been looking at any of the feedback in the chat, lots of people have been saying how great this has been. Just very quickly, for anyone who is interested in getting involved and lobbying for the federal CDRLA, or learning more about that, please look on our website or look into that more. And I think we're doing some organizing around that in the next few months still. We are off next week. Happy Rosh Hashanah, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. We have Lithos Carbon coming on October 4th and then Repair on October 11th. So please do sign up for that. I think all the links are in the chat somewhere, if you haven't already done so. And we'll announce
for the OCB workshop next week. We really hope to have as many people online as we can.
Yes, absolutely.
So check out our website, register.
Great. And yeah, I'm going to leave this open for another couple of minutes just for anyone. I know the chat has a bunch of useful links in there. So in case people still want to copy paste any of those, I'll leave this up. But other than that, thank you guys so much for joining. Dr. Cross, thank you so much for this amazing presentation, and hope to see you all soon. Bye for now.